We've all played at least one game that seems to have very little in common with the rest of the series it's a part of. There's always a chance that the developers went a buck wild and deviated too far by getting creatively overzealous, but it's also very likely that the game you're playing was never actually intended to be a part of the franchise that's in its title. Companies have been known to do this for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes they pull it off and nobody notices, and other times you get Star Fox Adventures. I personally have played quite a few games like this and had no idea, only to find out years later that they were reworked into a different IP than initially intended. So today, let's take a look at some prime examples of games that were never meant to bear the titles that they do. I'm gonna start off with just a little bit of an exception, a game that was supposed to be a sequel in another franchise and instead was tacked on to a totally different IP. Hot off the trail of Diddy Kong Racing, Rare was creating a sequel for the Game Boy Advance that would focus on the plane aspect of Diddy Kong Racing. Diddy Kong Pilot, as it was going to be called, never actually saw the light of day since Rare lost the ability to use the Donkey Kong IP after being bought by Microsoft. As I'm sure a lot of people know, despite being bought by Microsoft, Rare was still able to develop games for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance. So instead of shelving the entire thing altogether, Rare instead reworked the game with a new roster, and naturally the Banjo-Kazooie universe was the most fitting. The result became Banjo Pilot, a racing game similar to most other kart racers at the time, only you're in a plane, and only a plane. It's basically just a kart racer without the ability to drift, and the added burden of difficult depth perception. The game is not great, its controls are cumbersome, and quite honestly I can't seem to find any legitimate reason why the game is focused on flight at all. Being that you're in a plane, you can ascend and descend, but the tracks never actually take advantage of that. Even more egregious is the fact that veering off the intended track slows your plane down. Try wrapping your head around that one. The game has all the typical kart racer fare, multiple themed tracks, items that pretty much all do what you'd expect them to do if you've ever played Mario Kart, and the boost rings straight out of Diddy Kong Racing. The tracks themselves don't really amount to much more than straight lines and turns with a Banjo-Kazooie aesthetic. There really aren't any cool gimmicks to speak of, and once again, the fact that you're flying in a plane makes the uninspired track layout stick out even more. To be honest, this could have just as easily been a regular kart racer and it probably would have worked better. Looking back at builds that do exist of Diddy Kong Pilot, the games are virtually identical save for the scenery and characters. There also is an early build of Banjo Pilot that exists where the environments were actually 3D, but apparently this proved too taxing for the GBA hardware. This isn't the worst kart racer I've ever played, and I guess it's worth visiting if you're a fan of Rare's work, but it really doesn't do anything to make itself anything more than a quirky little novelty with an interesting backstory that you'll probably get tired of after 10 minutes of playing it. The Contra IP has built quite the legacy for itself, with multiple releases being considered classics of their time. There was one game in the franchise, however, that left a lot of people confused back in 1992. As the story goes, Contra Force, a game that ended up only being released in America, was originally going to be a Japanese game called Arkhound, which was actually pretty far in development, but then was cancelled for an apparently unknown reason. Seeing as the game was so far in development, instead of just scrapping the whole thing, Konami decided to rebrand it as a Contra game, despite not changing the game around to fit the Contra universe better. People have been trashing this game for years upon years, but I honestly think it has more to do with it not living up to the Contra name and less to do with it actually being a legitimately terrible game. It's more like aggressively mediocre. Like I said, they didn't change the game around to fit the Contra universe, so instead of fighting alien invaders like you typically would, you're now taking part in something much more like present-day war. So less Contra, more Metal Slug. Although being different enough from the core Contra series to definitely tell something weird happened during the game's development, the influences are incredibly obvious, and it totally makes sense that Konami thought they could just pull the wool over everyone's eyes. Conversely, though, they must not have had much confidence in the game considering they never released it outside the US. Despite it being not all that great, there's a few notable things that Contra Force brought to the table though, like being able to select different characters and a power-up system akin to Gradius. Gradius? Gradius? Whatever. Due to a situation that's almost as confusing as how a few old Final Fantasy games are titled, this game's existence is actually the reason Contra 3 ended up being called Contra 3. This is a bit of a confusing mouthful, but initially Contra Force was going to be called Contra 3. What would end up being titled Contra 3 for the SNES was going to be called Contra 4, and due to more development issues causing the NES game to be delayed, the Super Nintendo game ended up coming out as Contra 3, and they decided to call this one Contra Force, not to be confused with Contra 4. All in all, I don't really think this is a terrible game, but it sure is a weird blemish on the Contra franchise. Anyone who was a fan of Quake back in the 90s and then went on to play its sequel, Quake II, was probably a bit confused at the fact that outside of gameplay fundamentals, the two games are essentially nothing alike. The first Quake game was a mishmash of different gothic, medieval, and Lovecraftian influence, not exactly having a true identity or cohesive story of its own, but somehow being unique in itself due to that fact. I myself was pretty taken aback when I went to play the sequel and suddenly I'm in a sci-fi setting fighting aliens. Quake II's development was a bit weird, as when it was initially being created, it wasn't exactly supposed to be a sequel to Quake in the first place. The game itself being what it is, though, isn't exactly surprising, and I can't really blame id for this, considering half the team who worked on the original game weren't a part of Quake II's development. Now fighting against the alien Strogg race, the game was originally going to kick off a whole new IP, with one of the tentative titles being War, spelled W-O-R. Being an entirely new story and setting, the game drops basically all the aesthetics and tone of the game that came before it. Despite it being a pretty decent game in its own right, I've always held a little bit of resentment for it. I do like it, and it is good, but ever since the Quake franchise took on the Strogg story, the original gothic medieval style was never revisited. Quake is one of my favorite games of all time, and I've always been pretty bummed that it never got a proper in-universe sequel. It's worth noting, though, that Quake II and its engine were actually really advanced at the time, and it was a technical marvel in its own right. So much so that John Romero, who at this point had left id and was working on the ill-fated Daikatana, ended up moving that game, which was being built on the original Quake engine, to that of Quake II. I always did like Quake II, and its soundtrack is super good as well. It just always left this weird taste in my mouth knowing that it's probably one of the biggest reasons why I never got a true sequel to one of my favorite games. It's no secret that Kirby's epic yarn deviates pretty far from Kirby's other platforming outings. Now, the Kirby franchise is no stranger to spin-offs, but when Good Feel started to develop Kirby's epic yarn, it actually was never intended to be a Kirby game in the first place. The game was originally going to be a brand new IP starring Prince Fluff, but at some point during development, Nintendo pushed the idea to have the game be reworked as an entry in the Kirby series, most likely in an effort to boost sales. Fortunately for Prince Fluff, the character wasn't canned and was still an integral part of the game and story, but ended up taking a backseat for Kirby while still acting as a playable character for Player 2 in co-op mode. When it came out, the game's visuals were super impressive and still look good to this day, despite being outshined by a future Good Feel title, Yoshi's Woolly World. Still, what they managed to pull off on the Wii is extremely commendable and does still hold up. The game itself is probably one of the easiest games I've ever played in my entire life, but I think that's the point, considering the slow pace of the game coupled with the fact that you literally can't die. I can't say it's a very exciting or super engaging game, but Kirby's Epic Yarn is a very relaxing and pleasant experience. Typically in a platformer, a lot of the fun comes from the challenge, but much like the Kirby franchise as a whole, this game seems to flip the genre on its head, and a lot of the enjoyment that can be had from playing this game comes from just how pleasant and charming it is, and it's especially good in co-op mode. I can't say this game breaks any kind of ground or really stands out for anything other than its art style, which admittedly at the time was very fresh, but it's the kind of game that knows exactly what it is and isn't trying to be anything more than what's right in front of you. Except for maybe the fact that it was trying to be a Kirby game, but it kind of sort of isn't. It's still a fun game to play though, and considering the amount of unorthodox spin-offs that flood the Kirby franchise, it honestly fits right in. Well, Rare's at it again. You all knew this was coming. Now, I'm not gonna spend any more time on this than I have to because you know it, I know it, the American people know it. Star Fox Adventures was never supposed to be a Star Fox game. The story's been told a million times by a million different people, but the short version is, Rare was hard at work making a Zelda clone called Dinosaur Planet, and due to influence at Nintendo, ended up Frankensteining their original IP into an entry in the Star Fox franchise. I don't really think anyone wanted this. This was straight up just a terrible idea. There is one thing that bothers me more than anything else about the story of this game's development, and I don't ever see anyone else mirror the sentiments that I have, so today I'm finally going to talk about it. Unfortunately, not only did this game piss off the entire Star Fox fanbase, but in one fell swoop, it killed off a franchise that never got a chance to stand on its own. The fact of the matter is, despite how derivative of the Zelda franchise it was, and no matter how many fundamental design flaws the game had, at its core, Star Fox Adventures isn't necessarily a horrible or non-functional game, and I think the groundwork that they set could have easily led to a pretty good and original IP if Rare actually got to release the game as Dinosaur Planet and then potentially really stretch their wings with a sequel. I think enough evidence exists in Star Fox Adventures for there to be room to have made a more refined and enjoyable sequel. Because of Nintendo's silly meddling though, we never got the original Dinosaur Planet, and because of that, we will more than likely never see what this IP could have really been. Who knows, maybe in a different timeline, Dinosaur Planet is its own franchise with multiple entries and it's a beloved series that got its start as a game largely influenced by Zelda, but that's a timeline that unfortunately none of us will ever know. Instead, we have a timeline where the only Star Fox games people like are ones where they just remake the first one, and even that's proving to not work anymore. Now look, I'm not saying Dinosaur Planet would have been some amazing feat of game design, but the world and characters they built were solid, and I definitely could have seen that universe taking off as its own thing if it ever got the chance. Unfortunately, Dinosaur Planet never was, and it never will be. Reworking games into IPs they weren't originally supposed to be a part of is an age-old practice, and I know there are a bunch more games that fit this criteria, so depending on how this goes, if enough people like this, maybe this is a subject I can revisit in the future. That being said, if you have any suggestions, feel free to comment them below. As for this video, that's all I've got for today. Hey, thank you for watching the video. If you want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can click on. And if you want to see everything I upload, click the subscribe button and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.